He was a rancher, weathered by a grief so profound it craved only silence. She was a young woman, barely 19, pregnant, and sold like chattel, a raw deal handed down by her own kin. In the stark, unforgiving landscape of the West, their paths collided in a transaction born of desperation, not desire. But beneath the crushing weight of unspoken sorrows and bitter pasts, an unexpected connection began to flicker. Could this desperate bargain, meant only to purchase quiet, actually lead to the miracle he'd unknowingly awaited his entire life and the redemption she never dared to dream of? Join us as we delve into their extraordinary journey, where silence speaks volumes and hope blooms in the most barren of hearts. Under the cloak of a bruised twilight, the air behind the feed store hung thick with the miasma of sweat, kerosene, and a silence bought too cheap. Elara, barely 19, felt the raw chafe of iron cuffs on her wrists, snapped on by her own mother an hour past. Her swollen belly, a testament to 8 months of a life spiraling, heaved as she sat on the dirt floor, her gaze fixed on nothing, refusing any eye that might dare to meet hers. 8 months gone, and you ain't thought she needs a doctor? Silas's voice, low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed, sliced through the oppressive air. Not angry, not kind, just weary. She needs a husband, not some damn sawbones. The older woman, her face a roadmap of hard living, spat back. Her cracked lips curled as she shifted her weight from one mud-caked boot to the other. A man like you ought to know the difference. I do not need a wife, Silas stated, his eyes not on Elara but on some distant point behind her, as if deciphering ghosts in the wood grain of the shack's walls. I need quiet. The exchange was finalized with a grim economy of sound. 2 silver coins, dull with age, 1 jug of whiskey, and a promissory note for half a butchered steer come autumn. Elara's mother unlatched the cuffs with the same indifference she'd show untying a sack of potatoes and shoved Elara towards the door. Don't give him trouble, she muttered, her voice a venomous whisper. He paid more than you're worth. Silas didn't touch her. He merely nodded towards the waiting horse, its mane slick with nervous sweat. Elara, her eyes burning, her throat raw from unshed tears, climbed up slowly. The 3-mile ride to his homestead was a symphony of wind and silence, played out across dust-choked trails and under the looming, breath-like shadows of the pine line. His house perched on the edge of nowhere. No neighbors, no fences, just untamed land, stretching to the horizon, and a porch that looked like it hadn't heard laughter in a generation. He helped her down, a fleeting impersonal touch, then motioned towards the door. Inside, the air was clean, almost unnervingly so. No trace of tobacco, no lingering perfume of a woman, only the faint scent of wood smoke and lemon oil. A single photograph hung crookedly over the mantel. A woman with bright, hopeful eyes, her hands wrapped around a baby blanket. The child, tellingly, was missing. You can stay here, Silas said, his voice still flat, pointing to a room on the left. The bed is firm. There's water by the stove. I won't come in without knocking. Elara didn't speak. Her fingers hovered near the hidden fold of her boot where, days ago, she'd sewn in a thin, sharp blade. She nodded once and stepped inside. The room smelled of dried lavender and dust. The bed, covered in a quilt too fine, too lovingly stitched for the rest of the Spartan house, dominated the small space. A brush, a small mirror, and a pair of unused women's shoes sat neatly beside the dresser. It wasn't a prison, yet the bars felt invisibly present. Later that night, long after the coyotes began their mournful serenade to the distant stars, Elara lay awake. One hand rested protectively on her belly, the other wrapped around the hilt of her dagger. The baby kicked, a sharp reminder of the life within her, and her breath caught. She listened for footsteps, for any sign of the man in the other room. Nothing but the relentless wind and the occasional creak of an old beam settling. Around midnight, she slipped from under the quilt, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. The knife, small but wickedly sharp, slid free. She crept towards the front room. No light, no sound, only the frantic thrumming of her own heart against her ribs. She reached the porch. Rain had begun to fall, a thin cold whispering against the weathered wood. And then she saw him. Not in bed, not watching her. Silas was kneeling on the wooden boards, an oil lamp guttering beside him, threading new leather into a torn saddle. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands steady, methodical. The rain soaked his shirt, dripped from his dark hair, but he seemed oblivious. He spoke softly, to no one, or perhaps to the ghosts she'd sensed earlier. "She always said this place needed mending," he murmured. She meant more than the fences. Elara stood frozen, the knife hanging uselessly by her side. He looked up then, finally seeing her through the silver veil of rain. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice devoid of accusation. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. He nodded once, then returned to his saddle, stitching through the quiet, rain-soaked night. Back in her room, Elara slid the knife under her pillow. Not out of trust, not yet, but out of something more complex, something that ached a little less than pure fear. In the morning, he left bread and a small pot of blackberry jam on the kitchen table. No note, no questions, just bread, and a silence that, for once, wasn't heavy with threat, but simply still. The morning sun, a hesitant visitor, spilled through the lace curtains of the room Silas had given her, casting soft golden shadows across the hand-stitched quilt. Elara sat upright. The scent of dried lavender, which had seemed melancholic the night before, now mingled with something older, fainter, cedar, the ghost of rose petals, and the undeniable perfume of time. The room, she realized, had been preserved, a shrine untouched for years. A hoop of unfinished embroidery lay on the windowsill, a single thread trailing like a forgotten promise. Beside it, a book of psalms, its cover worn thin with use. In the center of the far wall, the portrait hung, still slightly tilted. The woman from the photograph, no older than Elara herself, with dark hair pinned neatly and a quiet, waiting look in her eyes. Silas never entered her room. Each morning she woke to warm cornbread left outside her door, a kettle already singing softly on the stove. Some days there were extra firewood bundles neatly stacked, or a clean, mended dress folded at the end of her bed. He said little, just a nod when she passed. At night, the house settled into a profound stillness, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock and the faint companionable crackle of firewood surrendering to ash. Elara had known homes where yelling filled the walls like toxic smoke, where hunger paced the floors like a caged animal, where silence was a weapon, sharp and angry. But this silence was different. It didn't watch her with suspicion. It simply let her breathe. One afternoon, as the wind shifted and clouds gathered low and bruised over the valley, a sharp knock at the front door startled Elara as she peeled carrots by the open kitchen window. Before she could react, Silas opened it. A woman in a severe black bonnet stood on the porch, mud caking her boots, her jaw set like stone. "Agnes," Silas said, his voice even, betraying nothing. "Came for eggs," the woman snapped, her eyes sharp as flint, sliding past him to fix on Elara. "And to see this girl you brought in." Elara instinctively stepped back, the roundness of her belly unmistakable even under her shawl. "Well," Agnes hissed, her hands planting themselves firmly on her hips. "Ain't she ripe? Barely grown herself and already swelled up like a fall pumpkin. What's the matter, Silas? Town too quiet for you without a scandal?" Silas didn't move, his frame filling the doorway. She your new pet, Silas?" Agnes spat, her voice laced with venom. "Didn't take you long, did it? After burying your wife? Now you bring in some barefoot hussy from the flats. You always did like 'em young." Elara froze, the paring knife in her hand trembling. She expected Silas to roar, to defend her, to deny the woman's vile accusations. But he simply looked at Agnes, his jaw tight. "You want eggs?" he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Take them." He turned, walked into the kitchen, and returned with a small basket. He held it out without a word. Agnes snatched it, her eyes still burning holes through Elara. "She won't last, you know," Agnes sneered, her gaze raking over Elara one last time. "Trash never does." Still Silas said nothing. He stepped back, placed one hand gently on the door, and closed it. Not slammed, just closed. The click of the latch echoed in the profound silence that followed. Elara stood for a long time after Agnes left, her fingers resting on her belly, the child stirring within. She waited for Silas to explain, to apologize, to tell her she was not what that woman had said. But he didn't. He returned to the porch, took his place on the worn wooden rocker, and began whittling a piece of cedar, his gaze fixed on his hands. He had not defended her. He had not denied it. He had just shut the door. That night Elara sat at the edge of the bed, brushing out her long dark hair in front of the small mirror. Behind her, the portrait of the other woman, the wife, watched in its perpetual stillness. Elara whispered to it, almost without meaning to, "He's more afraid of their words than mine." And she realized then, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, he had not bought her to save her. He had bought her because he had stopped believing in his own worth, because ghosts were easier to live with than people, because silence could not accuse him of anything. But she was not a ghost. She was still alive, and her child would be too. The wind howled like something feral that night, rattling the shutters and creeping through the floorboards like cold, inquisitive fingers. Elara lay in bed, eyes wide open, every muscle tense. Each creak of the old house, each sigh of the wind, fed her growing unease. She had counted the days, nearly 2 weeks since her mother had sold her off like breeding stock. Silas had not touched her, had barely spoken more than a dozen necessary words. But the silence was no longer a strange comfort. It felt like waiting for a rope to tighten. She rose without lighting the lamp, dressing quietly in the long dark coat Silas had left hanging on a peg by her door. The blade, tucked securely in her boot, pressed against her ankle. A grim reminder that freedom, true freedom, always came with a price. She pulled on thick socks, wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and stepped out through the back door. The cold hit her like a physical slap. Snow had started falling, light but fast, already piling over the cracked stone path. She pressed on through the biting wind, teeth clenched, her boots crunching softly on the accumulating snow. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away. Away from the house with the silent, haunted man. Away from the poisonous whispers of women like Agnes. Away from the palpable ghost of a woman who seemed to inhabit every shadow of that bedroom. But a sudden, vicious twist of pain in her side stopped her mid-step. She gasped, grabbing the icy railing of the well house for balance. Another jolt, lower this time, and stronger, sharper. She doubled over, the snow stinging her knees as she fell. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, fogging in the dark air. "No," she whispered, pressing her palm to the taut curve of her belly. "Not now. Please, not now." A sound. Footsteps, heavy and fast, crunching through the snow. Then Silas's voice, rough with an urgency she'd never heard before. "Elara." She didn't answer. She couldn't. The pain surged again, stealing her breath, blurring her vision. Then his hands were under her, lifting her with surprising ease, her body pressed against the soaked wool of his coat. He carried her back into the house without a word, straight past the dying fire in the main room, into the unexpected warmth of her own quilted bed. He knelt beside her, his face flushed from the cold, and placed a calloused, surprisingly gentle hand on her stomach. His voice, when it came, was low and strained, raw with an emotion she couldn't name. Do not let your child die because of what people say. His words struck her like thunder in a quiet sky. She stared at him, unable to look away. In that moment, he was not the silent man who avoided questions, who shut doors on ugly truths. He was someone else, someone who knew intimately what it meant to lose. Later, when the pain had dulled to a persistent ache and her breath returned to a semblance of normal, Elara spoke. For the first time, she spoke of her past. She wanted me to serve drinks, she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the small hearth Silas had lit in her room. To pour whiskey and sit on laps and smile like nothing mattered. The miners, they paid better if the girl was pretty. She paused, her fingers gripping the edge of the quilt. I said no. Once. Just once. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. She locked me in the goat shed for 2 nights. After that, I stopped saying no. Silas said nothing. He just stared into the fire, his broad shoulders tense. I ran, Elara continued, her voice barely a whisper. Found a job cleaning sheets at a boarding house in Dry Creek. That's where I met him, the father, a bitter twist to her lips. He was kind, until he wasn't. She looked at Silas then, her gaze direct. I don't even know if he knows. I don't know if I want him to. Silas nodded once, slowly. Then he rose, set a fresh log on the fire, and left her to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. Elara drifted in and out of fractured half-dreams. Her mother's harsh voice, the cloying smell of cheap whiskey, the suffocating weight of a man's breath on her skin. Sometime after midnight, she woke with a start. There was a sound, a faint heartbreaking sound. Crying. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. The baby. No, it was coming from outside her room. She rose quietly, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. She walked towards the source of the sound and stopped at the end of the short hallway. Through the partially open doorway of the main room, she saw Silas. He was seated by the front window, the moonlight tracing silver lines across his weathered face. In his lap, cradled with an almost unbearable tenderness, lay a tiny dress, pink, hand-stitched, delicate as a sigh. He held it like one would hold a memory they were afraid to break. She made it after the 3rd, Silas said softly, without turning, as if he'd sensed her presence all along. Still believed it'd be different next time. Elara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. The 3rd... What? The 3rd loss, he said, his voice hollow. She lost 7. I buried each of them myself, behind the ridge. Boys, girls. We never named them. He traced the delicate hem of the tiny dress with one calloused finger. I buried this one, after the 7th. Couldn't look at it anymore. Elara stood in silence, the air in the room thick with a sorrow that stretched beyond years, beyond words. And in that moment, she understood. He didn't shut the world out because he was cruel. He shut it out because it had taken everything, every single thing he had once dared to love. The morning after the crying, the snow had mostly melted, revealing the brown, brittle grass beneath. Elara stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas saddle his horse. He moved with his usual slow precision, but something had shifted between them. The previous night had transformed the quiet, not into words, but into something else. no longer made of fear or uncertainty, but of a shared, unspoken sorrow. After he rode off towards town, Elara wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped outside. The wind had softened, the air damp with thaw. She followed the narrow, worn trail behind the barn, her boots crunching on the half-frozen soil, past the chicken coop and the broken section of fence Silas hadn't yet mended. The faint footprints, his from earlier, led her farther than she had ever dared to go. Through a thinning grove of pine, up a gentle rise where the trees grew sparse and the sky widened, vast and pale. At the top of the ridge, she saw them. 7 small markers, weathered and uneven, arranged in a neat, heartbreaking line, like forgotten prayers. No names, just numbers, crudely etched with a blade into the graying wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She knelt before the last one, the 7th. The earth there was newer than the rest, the grass struggling to take root. A single stunted wildflower, bent from the recent cold, leaned against the marker as if in mourning. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and laid her hand on the wood. It felt warm somehow, impossibly warm beneath her palm. And just like that, the tears came. Not tears of fear or shame or loneliness, but tears for the sheer, crushing weight of it all. The silence she had mistaken for menace. The grief she had mistaken for cruelty. Silas was not the monster the village whispered about in shadows. He was a man who had buried 7 pieces of his hope, one by one, in this cold, unforgiving earth. She cried for them, for him, for herself. She didn't hear him approach, but when she finally looked up, tears streaming down her face, he was there, standing at the edge of the grove, his hat in his hands, his eyes unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched her, the way someone watches a fire, knowing it can warm or destroy. I thought you killed her," Elara whispered, her voice thick with unshed grief and dawning understanding. "The woman in the picture. Your wife." "I know what they say," Silas replied, his voice soft, carrying on the damp air. "And I let them." "Why?" "Because arguing takes more breath than silence." His eyes drifted to the 7 small markers, then back to her. Each one took a little more from her, and from me. By the 7th, there was nothing left. He paused. "She tried to plant roses here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the barren patch. "Never grew. Soil's too thin. Wind takes the petals." Elara stood slowly, her hand brushing the edge of the 7th wooden marker. "Maybe this spring," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We try again." For the first time, his face shifted, a barely perceptible flicker of something that might have been disbelief, or perhaps a different, more fragile emotion. Then he nodded, once, the slow, deliberate way a man nods when he hears something he didn't realize he desperately needed to hear. They stood there a while longer, beneath the wide, pale sky that promised more cold before true warmth. The ridge felt sacred, not in the way of churches built by human hands, but in the way of pain remembered and honored. Then, without a word, they walked back down the hill together, their steps slow, even, and side by side. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. The days lengthened, and the snow began to pull back its icy fingers from the earth. Shoots of stubborn green poked through the frozen ground. The sky, no longer a flat, oppressive gray, was tinged with the pale, hopeful blue of an approaching spring. Something within the house shifted too. Not loudly, but gently, quietly, like the turning of a season. Elara no longer waited for Silas to leave before stepping outside. She joined him, pulling on old work gloves she found in the barn. holding nails as he mended the south fence, handing him boards as he patched the roof of the woodshed. She limped a little now, the weight of her belly more pronounced with each passing week. But she moved with a newfound purpose. At noon, she cooked. Corn stew, beans, sometimes a rabbit Silas trapped that morning. Sometimes he spoke, short, declarative sentences about the weather or the land. Most times he listened, a quiet presence across the small kitchen table. And every evening, as the fire crackled and the sky outside turned from beaten gold to deep navy, Elara read aloud from the worn Bible that sat on the kitchen hutch, its pages soft and pliant from years of turning. She read slowly, sometimes pausing to ask questions, to wonder aloud about the meaning of certain passages. "What does it mean?" she asked one evening, her finger tracing a verse, "when it says sorrow may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning?" Silas, carving a spoon from a piece of hickory in his rocking chair, replied without looking up, his knife moving with steady precision. "It means sometimes you have to lose something precious to understand what's truly worth finding." One afternoon, Elara stood near the porch where Silas tended to a crooked line of wooden stakes he'd driven into the ground along the fence line. She noticed the soil around them was darkened, turned fresh. Beside each stake sat a small, knobby bulb, half buried. "You're planting roses again," she said, stepping closer. He glanced up, wiping his earth-stained hands on an old rag. "They won't take. Never have." Elara crouched slowly, with some difficulty now, beside one of the stakes. Her hands, surprisingly gentle, pressed lightly into the cool earth. "Then why keep trying?" Silas shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his broad shoulders. "Because she believed they would," he said, his voice quiet. "Said even the hardest ground gives in, if you're patient enough." "And you?" Elara asked, looking up at him. He hesitated, then met her gaze fully. "I never believed it," he admitted. "But I kept planting, because when she looked out and saw them, even the ones that didn't bloom, she smiled like they did." Elara swallowed the lump that had risen in her throat. She reached for one of the stakes, her fingers turning the soil gently, carefully, recovering the bulb. "I think she was right," she said softly. Later that night, as the wind whispered secrets against the window panes and the warmth from the stove wrapped the small room like a comforting blanket, Elara sat at the table, one hand resting on her stomach. The baby kicked beneath her palm, a rhythmic, strong pulse. "If it's a girl," she said softly, her gaze on the fire, "I'll name her Rose." Silas looked up from his whittling. His eyes met hers, quiet, steady. "She'll be stubborn," Elara added, a faint smile touching her lips. "She'll grow where no one thinks she can, even if it takes time." Silas set his carving aside. He nodded, not quickly, but with a certain weight, a gravity. "That's a good name," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and a better hope." The silence between them that night was no longer a wall. It was something shared, like a field waiting for seeds to bloom, like the sacred space between one heartbeat and the next. For the first time in weeks, Elara did not dream of the grim mining town, or her mother's cruel fists, or the suffocating smell of whiskey on a stranger's coat. She dreamed of sunlight filtering through rose petals, of small, chubby hands tugging at her braid, of Silas smiling, not just with his mouth, but with his whole face, as a little girl with dirt-streaked cheeks chased chickens through a field of wildflowers. And in the dream, the roses bloomed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. The wind that night was different. Hot, dry, charged with an unnatural stillness that made even the coyotes fall silent. The sky above the ridge had turned a bruised, angry shade of purple, and thunder rolled low in the distance, like a warning drum from the heavens. Silas stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. A jagged flash of lightning split the horizon, followed seconds later by a crack of thunder so sharp, so violent, it seemed to split the sky itself. Then came the smell. Acrid, biting. Smoke. Elara was setting dishes on the table when the first insidious curl of haze drifted through the open window. She paused, her nostrils flaring. The baby moved restlessly inside her, a sudden urgent fluttering, as if sensing the impending danger. Silas burst through the door, his face grim. "There's a fire," he said, his voice tight, already reaching for blankets stacked in a corner. "Up by Briar Ridge. Wind's bringing it this way. Fast." Elara moved to the door, her hand flying to her throat, looking out towards the tree line. Flames, angry and alive, flickered on the distant slope like malevolent stars falling to earth. "We need to move," Silas said, his movements quick, efficient, shoving cloths into a bucket of water. "The old stone hut, North Trail. It's safe there." Elara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as she turned to grab her coat, a sharp, agonizing pain stabbed through her spine, forcing her to double over with a gasp. "Silas!" she cried, clutching the edge of the table for support. He was at her side in seconds, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It's time," she whispered, panic rising in her throat like bile. "The baby." Another contraction hit, harder this time, stealing her breath, blurring her vision. Smoke, thick and choking, began to pour into the cabin. The fire was coming. Fast. Silas did not hesitate. He soaked 2 blankets in the bucket, wrapped one around her shoulders and the other around himself like a makeshift shield. Then, with strong, steady arms, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her belly protectively against his chest. "Hold on," he gritted out and kicked the door open. Outside, the world had turned into a hellish orange inferno. Ash, hot and stinging, floated through the air like demonic snow, and the wind screamed across the field, carrying sparks and embers with it. The trail to the stone hut twisted through a narrow ravine, half choked with dry brush, and the flames were hungry, devouring everything in their path. But Silas knew the way. He moved with a desperate speed, his breath coming in short, harsh bursts, his boots thudding over the dry, unforgiving earth. Elara cried out as another contraction, fiercer than the last, racked her body. "I can't," she gasped, her voice raw with pain and terror. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Silas gritted, his voice strained but firm. "Just breathe. Hold on to me." The fire was behind them now, but not far. Trees crackled and burst into flame along the ridge, the sound like monstrous applause. Smoke poured into the narrow trail like a black, suffocating tide. Elara buried her face into his chest, trying to block out the searing heat, the overwhelming fear, the relentless pain. Each jolting step sent fresh waves of agony through her. Each breath tasted of cinders and despair. Then, just as her vision started to fade, as the world narrowed to a pinpoint of unbearable suffering, they reached it. The old stone hut built into the hillside, part root cellar, part forgotten memory. It had once been a birthing place, too, long ago, in a time when hope had lived and breathed within its sturdy walls. Silas kicked the door open, carried her inside, and set her down gently on the straw-strewn floor. The walls were cool, thick, untouched by the inferno raging outside. He worked fast, laying her on the blankets, fetching water from a small barrel stored in the corner, lighting a tiny oil lamp that cast flickering, uncertain shadows. Outside, the fire roared, a monstrous, hungry beast. But the thick stone walls muffled the sound to a distant, rumbling thunder. Elara screamed as another wave of pain hit, her body buckling. She clutched Silas's hand, her nails digging deep into his flesh. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice broken. "So am I," he said, his voice hoarse, kneeling beside her, his face a mask of grim determination. "But you are not alone." Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. It was hard to tell. Pain bled into pain, time losing all meaning. Silas wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth, whispered words of encouragement, held her hand through every groan, every cry. He had seen death come through childbirth 7 times before, had watched hope wither and die in a room much like this one. But this time he fought. He fought for her. He fought for the tiny, unborn life. Finally, a moment of silence, a breathless pause. Then, a final guttural cry from Elara, sharp, raw, and undeniable. And then, over the sound of the wind and the crackling brush outside, came another cry, high-pitched, new, startlingly alive. A baby's wail, thin but fierce, filled the small stone hut. Elara gasped, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the soot and grime. Silas, his hands trembling, cradled the small, red, squirming bundle in his arms, wrapped it tight in a piece of clean cloth he'd produced from somewhere, and handed her over. "A girl," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion Elara had never heard from him before. "Aw." Elara laughed and cried at once, taking the child into her arms, pressing her face against the baby's damp, warm head. "Rose," she said, her voice choked. "She's Rose." Outside, the firestorm began to die, its fury spent. Inside the stone hut, against all odds, life had begun. The first hesitant light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the stone walls, soft and golden, carrying with it the scent of scorched earth and, miraculously, new life. The fire had moved on during the night, its destructive fury reduced to distant smoke trails rising lazily on the horizon. But its memory still lingered in the air, clinging to skin and breath like a persistent shadow. Inside the hut, however, something brighter, something infinitely more powerful, had taken root. The baby's cries rang out again, fierce, unrelenting, full of breath and a primal, new purpose. It was not the whimper of something fragile, but the determined cry of something meant to live. It echoed off the stone walls like a hymn, a sound no one had heard in that place before, not for 10 long silent years, and it shattered the oppressive weight of that silence in a single, breathtaking moment. Silas knelt beside Elara, his hands stained with soot and blood, his broad shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from something far more vulnerable, relief. His chest rose and fell in uneven, ragged gasps, as if he too had been reborn with the child. He looked down at Elara, who held the newborn to her breast with shaking arms, her face pale with exhaustion, but glowing with a fierce, protective wonder. There was dirt on her cheeks, sweat matting her hair to her brow. But her eyes were blazing. The baby, slick with the mess of arrival, squirmed and rooted blindly, searching for warmth, for milk, for a voice she might recognize. Her tiny, perfect fingers curled in the air like petals unfurling in the sun. Elara looked up at Silas through tears that had yet to dry. "She's strong," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "She's loud," Silas replied, his voice hoarse, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The deep lines etched into his face by years of grief seemed to soften for a fleeting second, making him look almost young again, like the man he might have been long ago, before sorrow had carved its indelible name across his back. He reached out his hand, unsteady, slow, as if approaching something sacred, something he wasn't sure he deserved to touch. With a trembling fingertip, he brushed the baby's cheek. Her skin was soft, impossibly soft, like silk warmed by firelight. She blinked, her eyes still cloudy with the blur of birth, and let out a yawn so small, so utterly human. It broke something open inside him, something that had been locked away for a decade. "Rose," he murmured, the name of prayer on his lips. "She'll be Rose." Elara cradled the infant tighter, her lips pressed to the child's damp hair. "You named her?" "No," Silas said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the tiny, perfect face. "You did. I just believe it now." He shifted, his body sagging with the weight of what had just passed, and leaned heavily against the cool stone wall. The smoke, which had receded, began to creep in through the cracks again, thin, pale, almost forgotten, but it clung to them still. Silas's face, streaked with soot, turned a whirring shade of gray. His lips were cracked, his eyes dulled. Elara's smile faded. "Silas?" He didn't answer. "Silas," she said again, louder this time, a cold knot of urgency tightening in her chest. The baby whimpered at her breast, sensing the sudden shift in her mother's tone. Still nothing. And then Rose cried. A piercing, angry wail that ripped through the air like a thunderclap. It was not a cry of fear or hunger. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated insistence. A call back to life. Silas gasped. His chest rose sharply, then fell. Another breath, rough, rasping, but undeniably alive. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they found Elara's face, her tear-streaked, terrified face. She's got lungs," he croaked, a faint, weak sound. Elara laughed, the sound breaking halfway into a sob. "So do you," she managed, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. He smiled, a faint, weary smile, his eyelids fluttering closed again. "Guess I'll need 'em." Outside, the fire smoldered into memory. The smoke lifted. And inside that battered, soot-blackened hut, the three of them stayed close, wrapped in silence, in breath, in the fragile, hard-won miracle of survival. Bound not by blood, but by the cry that named a child and resurrected a man. Bound by a rose that, against all odds, had bloomed in the middle of ruin. 1 year later, the house that once stood in stark, echoing silence now hummed with life. The wooden fence was rebuilt, sturdy and straight, already wrapped with the soft, determined vines of wild morning glories and the resilient grass that had returned with the spring rains. A cradle, carved from sweet-smelling cedar and smoothed by patient hands, sat by the front window, where a baby once slept and now often stood, learning to walk one wobbly, triumphant step at a time. The rose bushes by the porch, the one Silas had planted with such hesitant hope, had bloomed. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. Delicate pink and defiant red petals opened towards the sun, stubborn and tender. They grew where only failure and grief had lived before. Inside the house, laughter, a sound once alien to its walls, echoed in the kitchen. Elara, her figure fuller, her eyes bright, stirred stew, humming softly as Rose, a whirlwind of dark curls and determined energy, babbled on the floor, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. Silas sat at the table, mending a doll's torn arm with the same meticulous patience he once used to sew saddles and mend broken fences. Letters came now, sometimes wrapped in blue ribbon, sometimes tucked inside baskets of warm cornbread or jars of peach jam left on the porch. Some were hesitant apologies. Some were quiet blessings. All came from the same mouths that had once whispered cruelty and judgment. They left quilts, knitted socks, even a small folded note scribbled in a child's clumsy hand that simply said, "Sorry for what my mama said." The porch, once a lonely sentinel, became a gathering place on warm evenings. Sometimes neighbors stopped by, awkward at first, bringing pie or sharing old, half-forgotten stories. Elara never asked why they came. She just passed around the tin cups of cool water or cider and let them come again. One morning, Elara held Rose on her hip, pointing to the vibrant flowers by the fence. She called you Da yesterday, she said, smiling at Silas, who was inspecting a loose shutter. Silas raised an eyebrow. Before Ma? Elara laughed, a clear, joyful sound. Twice, I counted. He chuckled, that quiet, familiar sound that still made her chest ache in the best possible way. She's a clever one. She's yours, Elara said softly, her words meaning more than just shared parentage. He reached out and touched the child's rosy cheek. Then his gaze met Elara's, deep and steady. Ours, he corrected gently. That evening, as the sun melted into molten amber across the vast healing valley, Rose toddled barefoot through the yard, her dark curls bouncing with each uncertain step. One chubby hand clutched the stem of a freshly picked pink rose. She squealed with delight at a flitting butterfly, stumbled, and rose again, undeterred, her tiny face a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. Elara watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly, now round once more with new life. Silas stood beside her, his arm resting lightly, possessively, on her back. The land around them, once scorched and barren, had grown green again. Not perfect, not easy, but undeniably, stubbornly alive. And as Rose ran, laughing, into the golden fading light, the petals of her rose trailing behind her like scattered blessings, Elara whispered, "Some things must be lost, it seems, to make room for miracles. And even in a place turned to ash, flowers can still bloom. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the quiet strength of a man who thought he had nothing left to lose, the fierce resilience of a young woman rising from the ashes of betrayal, and the breathtaking miracle of a rose blooming from scorched earth, let us know. Give us a like, share a comment, or most of all, become part of our story by subscribing. This is Wild West Love Stories, where forgotten romances are brought back to life, where broken hearts learn to beat again, and where miracles often grow in the most untamed and unexpected places. Subscribe and stay with us through every tale of longing, redemption, and the kind of love that truly defied the frontier. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, so you never miss a story where bullets might have missed, but hearts certainly didn't. Thank you for riding with us. We'll see you in the next story. And so, Silas and Elara found their miracle, a love story written in resilience and bloomed from the ashes of despair. What part of their journey resonated most deeply with you? Was it Silas's quiet transformation, Elara's fierce strength, or the powerful symbolism of Rose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories of survival, redemption, and love found in the wild heart of the West captivate you, please show your support with a like. And to ensure you don't miss our next unforgettable romance, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We're thrilled to share more with you.